where we ended last time. Any questions from anybody? All set. All right. Just as a reminder, the first paper is due at the start of March, so we still got like a month before that's due. So quite a while. So let's see. We are halfway through chapter 15 now. Yeah, thereabouts. Still got a little ways before we'll get to that first test. So let's see what we can get done today. So we did piracy last time and the slave trade, which of course, the transatlantic commerce and all of that. And as I said last time, we'll get into something a little less depressing, and that's the military revolution. Because as I said, a bunch of Europeans consensually shooting each other out of the fields, to me, is far less depressing. New fortifications to resist sieges. This is something I actually talked about also in my American history class, where you've got the... Unfortunately, I didn't get any pictures. I feel bad about that, because this was one of the first classes I put together, so I didn't grab as many images as I normally would have. But where the bastions are angled out so that if the defenders want to try to hit the walls where they're thinnest, they're surrounded essentially by the defenders. It's a pretty cool system. It's unlike the old medieval fortresses where they've just got the round towers and then the flat wall. You've got now these angled bastions that come out to these points, and you can't really go through those because those are big, thick fortifications. The main walls are between those, and if you want to try to go into that, you're getting shot at from both sides. So it's pretty cool. Flint muskets. Flint muskets are, well, they use flint rather than matchlocks. Matchlocks are, well, it's what it says on the tin. You have to light a little piece of, it looks like rope when they do it in like documentaries and stuff, but it's typically like a slow burning fuse, like what would be used in a cannon. And when they go to fire it, it clicks down and hits the little piece of powder that's in the musket and fires. But if it's raining, that isn't going to work real well. A flintlock is better than that. Dowdy. Cool. A flintlock is, well, if you've ever used a flint to start a fire, it makes a spark when it hits, and that'll light it. And while it's still less effective in rain, it'll still work in the rain. Also, muskets are used more often. As time goes on, they can produce muskets in a more regular basis. They're less rare, less expensive, and you can have just whole platoons of musketeers. Once again, the Dutch volley firing techniques. As I mentioned, musketmen 10 deep. The first line fires, moves to the back and begins to reload, while the next fires. So by the time the first group is in the front again, they have reloaded and are ready to go. So unlike, again, when you would see in, not even really documentaries, but in historical fiction movies where they fire and they just like stand there for 5 minutes all reloading, You instead have volley fire, where the first group fires, they move to the back, the second group fires, so there's a constant hail of gunfire. Now this is before rifle barrels, so it's still pretty inaccurate. That's why you have the guys all standing in a line and shooting at the same time, because it's essentially one big shotgun. Warships and cannons. Cannons were made out of brass, like Gustavus Adolphus, we talked about in the 30 Years' War. Again, a Dutch invention. They were lighter and more mobile, so you could move them to different parts of the battle. It used to be cannons were made out of like iron, and they were a pain in the butt to move. You moved them by a horse. You put them on like a hill before battle, and that was where they stayed. The Dutch, again, were at the top of things, making 40-gun frigates with breech-loading cannons. I think that meant like, I think it was 40 guns per side. It was insane. And breech-loading cannons meant that, I do have a picture for this one. You could load it from the back rather than having to pull it all the way inside and load it from the front. So that also meant you didn't have to have as much room back here to pull it all the way in and reload it. You could just open it up, swab it out, load the cannon, load the barrel, load the ball, load the charge, close it up, and you're ready to go. Also, a 40-gun frigate. Yeah, you fire that thing. You fire all of them at the same time, and the whole ship's gonna lean. But yeah, that was naval warfare back then, man. It was serious. This was something we talked about a little bit last chapter. Where the old way of doing things, where the king would call together nobles and they would bring their armies together to fight war. Well, now the Europeans are constantly fighting each other in relatively low stakes war. It's not the 30 Years' War all over again, but there's constant little skirmishes. So the idea of a standing army took hold in the 16 and 1700s. The Spanish, French, and Austrians, as again they were constantly at war, meant that having an army ready at all times became pretty much necessary. And this meant not just having soldiers ready on the field, but also soldiers garrisoning outposts, so that should one side or the other make a move, you would know immediately and have at least some level of defense. Probably not, I mean, I say probably not, definitely not enough to repel an actual invasion, but at least enough to have a warning, hey, there's an army coming. Also, the Prussians, again, this is like the heart of what will become Germany. They had a 1 in 30 conscription ratio. That means 1 in 30 able-bodied men were conscripted into the army, compared to 1 in 100 in most other nations. So most of the Prussian army were native Prussians, as opposed to most other armies that employed mercenaries. Now, as we mentioned, mercenaries tended to be pretty professional. I mean, mercenaries that literally their job was to fight. What would be the benefit of having an army mostly of your own countrymen? Yes. That's right. And also, if the battle is going especially poorly, they're going to leave because you can't spend money if you're dead. I mean, yeah, again, your job is to fight, but also if the battle is very clearly going to suffer in a loss, you're going to get out of there. But if you're defending your homeland, say Prussia, you're more willing to stand and fight because you have a lot to lose. If you're a mercenary and you're defending some other guy's homeland and you're losing, So yeah. Now again, technically 1-to-1 a mercenary is going to be a better soldier, but when you've got someone defending their own homeland, they are going to be willing to fight harder and longer. And as time goes on, the Prussians do become more professional soldiers. And we've already talked about the Fredericks and whatnot. Prussia really does start to become like a major powerhouse. Speaking of the Prussians, they were also one of the first nations to really have like a proper uniform for their soldiers. Yeah, he got hit. He got shot, and the rest of the guys are just having to move on. That's where you learn who's got discipline and who doesn't. Your buddy next to you gets shot, it's like you gotta keep going. All right. This all costs a lot of money. Fortifications, new equipment, cannons, muskets, and, as I mentioned, uniforms. Paying and feeding these armies. So these regimes were basically geared towards war. We mentioned this actually back with Rome, where eventually Rome became a branch of the army as opposed to the army being a branch of Rome. It never quite got that bad, but the armies and navies were used to gain land and trade, to increase a nation's income, and then used to protect said acquisitions, and then those acquisitions were used to pay the military, and then the militaries were used to get more land, to get more money to pay the military, and then the military was used to, it was a never-ending cycle. Obviously, not a lot of that was able to happen in Europe because everybody already had land. So this is where we start spreading around the world, and, we'll talk about that. There's a whole chapter for that. Okay, I'm so excited to talk about this. The 7 Years' War was ridiculous. So this is seen as the first truly global war. A lot of historians like to jokingly call this the real First World War. It is at least the first real global war. It took place in Europe, the American colonies, India. So England and Prussia were seeking greater power. Spain, France, and Austria were trying to hold on to the power they had. There's a lot going on. So, we only really know about it normally from our, in American history, the French and Indian War, which I refuse to call it because it's a dumb name. And not a lot happened over here, relatively speaking. We're going to focus, obviously, on the European side of it, because, that's the class, and I find it far more interesting for reasons we will get to. So, Frederick the Great of Prussia. See, we got another Frederick. Don't worry about it. This was the Great. He's important. You can tell by the name. I don't actually know which Frederick this is, like, number-wise, but he's the Great, so he's important. He seized the resource-rich territory of Silesia from Austria while Austria was dealing with a war of Austrian succession. I guess they were clearly busy with the throne. Austria let them keep it because, again, they were busy with essentially a civil war. But then they further pissed off Austria by signing a defensive treaty with Britain in 1748, because Austria and Britain didn't get along. And Prussia figured what better way to upset Austria than getting along with someone they don't like. So Maria Theresa of Austria, the lady in charge of Austria, allied with France and Russia. Now, France makes sense because France and England have hated each other since literally 1066. And Russia is bordering Prussia, and it's Russia. So Frederick knew that he was surrounded now, because, France and Russia essentially have Prussia surrounded. This is going to be a thing going forward. So rather than just sit there and wait to see what happens, he decided to move first. He hit Saxony, which is I guess technically an Austrian holding, in 1756, gaining much wealth because they had a minting plant, and weakened Poland, which was also the Polish king, and again part of this Austro-whatever alliance. So here is, I guess that's Frederick. Okay, so this is where things start getting weird. So, again, Prussia, for its size, really strong. However, Prussia was not in a good place. Technically, Austria was already stronger than Prussia. If Prussia and Austria were fighting one-on-one, I'd say Prussia would probably have been able to win. Probably not take over Austria and become the new empire of Central Europe, but they probably would have been able to force Austria to sign a peace treaty and then everything be fine. But Russia is Russia, and they're massive. By 1762, Prussia was completely overrun. They were pushing into Brandenburg, which is the center of Prussia, and Frederick was contemplating suicide. He was so distraught that he had failed his country, that he was just going to end it all. He felt like he had betrayed his people by engaging in this war. And then Russia happened. So Tsarina Elizabeth died, and her successor, Peter III, took over. And Peter III was this massive fanboy of Frederick. And because the Tsar of Russia could do whatever the hell they want, he broke the alliance with Austria and gave Prussia all of its land back. Because he could. And Frederick's okay, cool, and pushed the attack onto Austria. And then Russian politics happened again. And Peter died suddenly. Let me pull from the book here. Peter III was placed under house arrest, and his wife Catherine took the throne, proclaiming herself, yada, 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 yada. Catherine II. 2 weeks later, Peter was dead, having succumbed to what his wife unconvincingly described as severe colic following a hemorrhoidal attack. My professor in grad school, as he described it, Catherine II, who actually was a German princess, who had been sent to Russia as an alliance thing. She had made friends with various members of the guard, including the captain of the guard, saw how Peter was ruining the country and was like, hey, captain of the guard, how about you strangle Peter? I'll become the new Tsarina and we'll fix things. So, as I put it here, and this was how my professor put it, the captain of the guard tied Peter's scarf a little too tight. Peter was out of the picture. Tsarina Catherine II renewed the war on Prussia, and Frederick sued for peace. However, this meant that the Peace of Hubertsberg, allowed Prussia to keep its territory and showed that this state could hold its own. I mean, granted, as soon as Russia got back into the party, they're like, okay, we're done. But they managed to hold out against they held out against Russia and Austria for a while, and as soon as Russia backed off, they just dogpiled on Austria, which should have been a peer state. So it not only showed that Prussia was tough, but also showed that Austria was kind of a paper tiger. And this, well, I'll get into it in a minute. I'm getting ahead of myself. So yeah, while technically Prussia didn't take a whole lot, this at least showed that Prussia's an up-and-comer. Here's Peter III. Doesn't really like a Russian ruler, does he? I mean, I know Peter the Great, was shaved and didn't look like, say Ivan the Terrible, but, I mean, I don't know what's going on with this guy. I don't have a picture of Catherine. I had a picture of Catherine before, I think. So the war in North America was known as the French and Indian War, which I refuse to use that name because it's dumb. Because the main opponent for the English colonists was the French and their native allies, although the English colonists also had lots of native allies, so yeah. The war was mostly between the colonists, so the English colonists and the French colonists. Not a lot of soldiers, really, from either side were there. It was just a lot of colonists fighting each other. 1756, war was declared North America. Pitt sought to take Canada. 1758, English victory was inevitable. Pitt pushed to cripple French control over the Caribbean. So he went east, and crippled French slave outposts in West Africa so they could take Guadeloupe and Martinique in the Caribbean easier. So he was thinking steps ahead. So rather than just hitting places in continental North America, North American outposts include the Caribbean, and since these slave outposts feed into the Caribbean, he hit the slave outposts to weaken them so they could take them easier. So yeah, William Pitt was quite the strategist. And he's just like some statesman. He wasn't even like a general or anything. He just knew what he was doing. Also, Spain entered the war on the side of France in 1762, and England just slapped them around. Took Manila. They ended up taking Gibraltar as well later. This appears to be a rare French victory. I'm always going to give the French a hard time. Oh, little joke here. Does anybody know why the English uniforms were typically red? There's like a morale reason behind it. I mean, kind of, but that's, yeah, purple, but it's a reason why especially the officers wore red on the field. So, hmm? Right. So if they get shot, their soldiers won't see it, and so they won't lose morale. So if you get shot while you're riding a horse, if you manage to stay on your horse and keep going, your guys won't know you got shot. So you can fake it till you fall off your horse, which was a common thing. Although the joke goes, there's a Frenchman and an Englishman talking, and the Englishman tells that story, and the Frenchman goes, "Oh, so that's why our captains wear yellow pants." Anyway, on to India. British and French traders also had allies in India, kind of similar to what was going on in America, except the Indian princes were the ones doing the fighting. Despite the fact that they were all technically under the authority of the Sultan, they were all very much at odds with one another. So when the English and French came along, they would ally with one or the other. I mean, again, much like the Native American tribes here, where they saw the English and French, and Spanish to a lesser degree, as like an outside power to use against their enemies. The Indians very much saw the English and French as like, well, here's these guys from outside who have pretty good technology. The Indians were aware of like gunpowder and whatnot. But like, hey, they've got troops and stuff, and they hate each other, and we hate these guys, so let's balance them against each other. The British did suffer some defeats in India. There's a particular thing, the Black Hole of Calcutta, which is mentioned in the book. These melodramatic images of Great Britain where basically they were forced into this tiny prison cell, and there's only like one little window, and they can barely breathe, and it's all very dramatic, and it's probably not completely made up, but most of it probably is, because the English are very dramatic when it comes to their ill treatment at the hands of people that aren't white, especially the Indians. We'll get to a lot of that a little bit later. For the most part, though, the war in India went really well for them. 1760, the blockade of the final French fort at Pondicherry. Pondicherry? God, that just feels really English now. Yeah, the native Indian powers are the ones that did most of the fighting. So here's the British territory that was held before the war, and then during the wars, there was territory deeper in. It started as like trading posts, and then the British East India Company started like taking land, and this became a nightmare. As I mentioned, having played Empire Total War, I spent most of that 100 years that they give you just trying to take India. And it wasn't even like, it was just because India is so big, and there's so much stuff going on. And like, even, there was even it was like 1700 to 1800, and like, 1776 happened. But apparently I was treating North America fine. Only Maine tried to rebel. And I was like, you can have it. I'll let them have it. Whatever. It's like, don't spread to the rest of my colonies. You can have Maine. And I was busy over here. But man, now I know why Britain sucks so bad. They've got so much crap going on. They don't have time for anything else. All right. So the peace treaties and the great powers. So the Peace of Paris, because of course, between the British and French, the Peace of Hood-Petersburg, between the Austrians and Prussians, both were signed in 1763. As I mentioned, Hood-Petersburg not a lot of land traded hands, um, but it made Prussia one of the great powers, which is important because in Europe, the great powers pretty much set the agenda for how Europe's going to move forward in the future, um, which I'll get to in just a second. Yeah. Um, Peace of Paris, though, was a major change of hands when it came to land. Um, Britain did actually return a lot of land to France because, well, if they had taken everything, France would have been really angry and immediately gone to war with them again. Actually gave a lot of islands back to France, um, which was pretty generous because a lot of the Caribbean islands were where France made most of their money. They did, however, keep a lot of naval stations, in particular, I already said it just a minute ago, Gibraltar. That was a cool thing for them because that's like right at the mouth of the Mediterranean. They also kept Canada, which they knew was important for like furs. That was cool. Also like lumber because you need that for building ships. They didn't know about the oil yet, which that wasn't quite important yet, but yeah, that was a big deal. So, following the end of the war, the great powers were Britain, France, Russia, Prussia, and Austria. And this would be how things went pretty much until World War I. Again, Prussia is Germany, or would be Germany. I was about to say anybody, if there was like a German person here, they're like, ah, we resent that. Prussia becomes Germany. But notice Spain isn't here. Spain had been a major player in Europe for so long, but after so many disasters, the Spanish Armada, the 30 Years' War, Spain just isn't anything anymore. Like, they tried to even join in with this, and they just get slapped around. Like, it was Spain just there. So, yeah. The 7 Years' War is important because it shapes up where we're going to be going for the next 200 years. Now, granted, obviously, the French Revolution is going to be a major hurdle for everybody. But this does set in stone really everything until World War I, which is pretty cool. All right. On to science. So, the scientific revolution, Francis Bacon, he introduced scientific method, have a hypothesis, and it must stand up to various empirical and experiments. This became the idea of empiricism. So yeah, basic scientific method, hypothesis, experimentation, and then the result. And if it doesn't stand up to the hypothesis was wrong, and that's fine because that's science. You don't try to prove your hypothesis right, you try to find the correct answer. And if you prove your hypothesis right, cool, do it again and make sure it worked right. And let other people do the experiment to see if maybe you have something different in your experiment. René Descartes, French philosopher, rejected Francis Bacon's ideas. I feel like that's partially due because he's French and Bacon is English, and they have to disagree. It's in their blood. In order to find truth, one must begin with truth. This is summarized as I think, therefore I am. It's philosophy, rationalism. But it's also important in questioning the established norms of society. Again, very different from empiricism, but it's still a different form of thought than what we had before. So while philosophy is a little outside my my area of expertise, again, I was very into the sciences before I moved into history, and I mean, I still technically got a Bachelor of Science in history because had so much biology under my belt. Philosophy is still important. So there is Francis Bacon and his glamour shot there, and Rene Descartes. I don't want to be biased, but he looks French. Like, he looks like he wants to say something. Like, you've got Bacon there, and it's like, oh, I want to be snide about it. Anyway. Cosmology. Going back a bit, I mean, 1400s, that's quite a bit. Copernicus argued that there was a sun-centered solar system. However, he died the year that his treatise was published, so his idea wasn't well known. It wasn't until Johann Kepler, this was in the late 1500s, early 1600s, that this was really publicized. Medici's court mathematician, Galileo. The church did not like his ideas of, again, a sun-centered universe, or at least a sun-centered solar system. And it was very much the Streisand effect of the church trying to censor his efforts, cause everybody to pay attention to what was going on. And everybody was like, oh, hey, these things that he's talking about are pretty legit. Like, the stuff we understand, because, I mean, like, even today, it's like, oh, man, this is some heavy crap. Like, physics and stuff is a little beyond me. Isaac Newton, light and gravity. Heavenly bodies follow the same set of physical laws as those on Earth, in his book Principia, which, again, is just like, how do you do that with these, like, old-ass telescopes? Like, oh, look, this dot going through the sky at a different speed than these other dots, which you can only see by, like, figuring out where the dots are with different times or different nights of the year. Clearly, it's a different heavenly body than these other dots, and they're following gravity. It's like, oh my God, dude, okay, cool. You're a lot smarter than I would have been. And yeah, like, I mean, this is Copernicus. This was like 1400, 1500s. Like, he figured, you've got the sun in the middle. He figured Mercury, Venus, Earth, and the moon. See, that one, Mars? That's Mars. Jupiter with its multiple moons, which, again, it's like insane that they were able to figure this out. Saturn, they couldn't figure anything beyond that because, again, they were very limited with the telescopes that they had. Look, this stuff, which this is a Galileo telescope. This isn't even what Copernicus was using. This is a famous experiment that Galileo used. Two different balls of varying weight, but because they're the same, they've got the same air resistance, they fall at the same speed. Weight doesn't matter. It's air resistance. This experiment was recreated on the moon by dropping a hammer and a feather. Because the moon doesn't have air resistance, they fell at the same speed. Which would have been weird to see. A hammer and a feather falling at the same speed. But, yeah. Which I guess you'd also be able to see in, like, a vacuum chamber here on Earth. But still, blah. I mean, I have seen like a feather in a vacuum chamber. It just straight down. But yeah, obviously using the. I don't think this was ever actually done using the Tower of Pisa, but this experiment was done. I don't know if it was actually using the tower. Here's like a freaking album art cover. But yeah, he using a prism and the movement of celestial bodies and like tides, figuring out that it was used the moon, which again is super cool. his telescope and all that, big ass books, and then of course the famous actually I got an image of that. The apple falling from the tree. He discovered gravity. It's like what? Yeah, the principle of gravity. Oh, yeah, this is super cool. Andreas Vesalius, student from Brussels, did his own dissections to prove there was more about the human body than what the classic scholars knew. Here's the thing. Human dissections were not real common. Anybody want to hazard a guess as to how this fella got his hands on human bodies? Yep. He was a grave robber. And it was once like he was started like writing stuff and became very famous, grave robbing became a problem because people were like, "Oh, we want to learn stuff," and oh, it was a problem. Inspired by this guy, William Harvey worked on better describing the circulatory system. The heart was seen as like a transfer station for blood. Obviously, it's hard to tell like how the circulatory system works when the body's dead. I mean, the heart is just this thing that's sitting there and it's got blood in it. Like, if you don't see it beating, like I don't know. It's hard to tell. I mean, I've dissected a heart in undergrad, like biology, and it's just a big muscle lump. Like, it's hard to really tell what you're supposed to be looking at. Yeah. Eventually, when these guys were a bit more famous, they were allowed to dissect like recently executed criminals rather than digging up graves. Although typically the graves they dug up were like recently executed criminals, they weren't like digging up somebody's grandma. But yeah, these guys were 100% grave robbers at the start. Again, the 1800s. No, this wasn't 1800s. I was getting ready to say the 1800s were wild. This was before that. Yeah, these guys were something else. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, wife of a British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, used the Turkish smallpox inoculation technique, sprayed to other major powers. Basically, and this is not 100% wonderful to talk about, but it worked. Where you would like take, it'd sort of be like a file, and get a little bit of the pus from a smallpox like boil, and then you would scrape that on yourself and get just a little bit of it in you, because that's the pus is the white blood cells fighting the smallpox, and it's going to have some of the smallpox in it, and you're basically giving yourself weakened smallpox, and fingers crossed it's going to be weak enough that your body's going to fight it and it won't kill you and then you're going to be immune to smallpox, because smallpox is it's a virus, so you're basically giving yourself a vaccine. This is an inoculation. It's not exactly the same as a vaccine, but it's same idea. Dang it. Later on, Edward Jenner discovered a safer system using cowpox. Apparently, it says Edward Jenner, it was actually like a cow maid who discovered it, but he took the credit because he was the one that realized what was going on, because like she never got sick, and like the people who were drinking the milk from the cows she was milking never got sick, and they were like, what's going on with your cows? And they realized, oh wait, the cows have cowpox, and like you got the cowpox from the cows, and since cowpox, like you can get it, but it doesn't really hurt people. But it's similar enough that the human body will fight off smallpox the same way it fought off the cowpox. It's really cool. It's really, really neat they were able to figure this out that long ago when they didn't fully understand like the way germs and stuff worked. It's really cool. Academies of Science, Royal Society in England, and the Académie Royale des Sciences in France. Founded by royal patronage, much scientific work was done between individual sciences communicating via mail. This created the Republic of Letters. Scientists could contribute across national and religious barriers. As I mentioned in the previous slide, the smallpox inoculation came from the Ottoman Empire, which was not somewhere that European scientists would normally like converse with, but the wife of the ambassador there was hanging out with, the Turkish doctors, I guess, and was like, hey, this is a really good idea. We should use this. So the Republic of Letters will be scientists writing to scientists in other countries, often even beyond just France and England getting along. So this was more than what we'd see in official channels, which is really cool. Women were involved to a smaller degree. The book here goes into greater detail than I've got there. Maria Winkelmann Kirch received scientific educations at home, worked together with their husbands. Maria's husband, Gottfried Kirch, high respected astronomer and calendar maker in Berlin. She helped him amass data for his calendars, also performed her own observations, recorded a new comet, though, of course, Gottfried was the one who got credit because women can't do things. After his death, the Berlin Academy of Sciences refused to allow Maria to continue making calendars for their use. She did find a private patron, which allowed her to work in his observatory. Maria also trained her son, Christfried, good God, that's very German, and her two daughters in astronomy. 1716, Christfried became the director of Berlin Academy's observatory. So yeah, there was a lot of women who did make observations and discoveries and stuff in sciences, but they weren't allowed to be credited because, well, again, this is the 1700s. So yeah. So there's a Royal Academy and the French one, as you can tell. So that's it for that chapter. Let's jump into 16 since we've got a little bit of time yet. And I was worried that I was getting a kidney stone this morning, but I'm not dying, so we can keep moving. All right, cool. Let's get into chapter 16, the Enlightenment. The mini enlightenments, as the book calls it, which, again, a little pretentious. All right. I'll go ahead and have this up on Blackboard after class. So, the Enlightenment was about a century of change. So the basic tenets of the Enlightenment were pretty simple, but obviously the old regimes didn't like it because it was change, and the people who are in power don't like change. Human mind could learn more about the world outside the basic truths of the church and the absolutist rulers. Well, again, were not something that the church and the absolutist rulers would like. The changes were multifaceted, as we're going to see. I mean, we've got a whole chapter here. were also different based on where you were. The English and Dutch republics were centers of change. Um, they were the most free and allowed the most enlightened change. Um, Absolutist France tried to stamp it out, even though, as we're going to see, um, Absolutist France is where a lot of it happened. It's a really weird thing where, like, one of the harshest places for the Enlightenment was where most of the Enlightenment famously happened. Um, I think probably because of the French Revolution and them, like, extolling the virtues of the Enlightenment afterwards, so we know so much about it. Further east, it was top down with Frederick the Great and Joseph II, push change, while in places like Russia, um, there was very poor literacy, so people couldn't read about the Enlightenment. And if you can't read, you can't become very enlightened. Um, the Enlightenment still happened in like the rulership, as we're going to see, like Catherine II, for example, was very fond of the philosophes and whatnot, but she wasn't too keen on spreading that to the people. So let's get into the start of this. So one of the main origins of the Enlightenment was the 30 Years' War, and people not wanting that to ever happen again. Brutal wars carried out in the name of religion, nobody wanted that. And the revulsion at the wars carried out in the name of religion caused people to want to change the world so that that would never happen again. And with these various quiet revolutions, as we saw in the previous chapter, picking up steam, making larger waves, this sentiment picked up more and more, with the world gradually becoming, well, more enlightened. Meritocracy, we talked about the table of ranks with Peter the Great, which again is weird since we just said that Russia was one of the least enlightened places, but there was some to that. Hiring of individuals based on their talent rather than birth, which was bad for the nobles because all they had was, who their family was. But it was really good for the country because it meant that people who were talented and actually knew what the hell they were doing could work for the country, could work for the kingdom, and help to improve the kingdom. And, increase, especially as we start getting towards the Industrial Revolution, increase the capacity of the kingdom for war, or even just like civil service and transportation, and really, especially towards the Second Industrial Revolution, building buildings and all sorts of stuff. So, once again, it was easier to push the Enlightenment in England and the Netherlands, the Dutch Republic, not technically the Netherlands. I'll get to that later. Certain scientific ideas were actually, as I said, fostered in France. The monarchy and the nobility were fine with, like, scientific enlightenment, because that, again, meant that they could increase their war-making capacity and have more efficient, like, taxes. As long as they didn't try any of this whole philosophical enlightenment thing, because that meant that the nobility and the monarchy might be threatened. Which, again, is something that had a little bit dealing with the Empire Total War. It's like, we want to improve the country. Cool. It's going to take away some of your power. I don't know about that. Because I really liked cannons. So this learned nobility had a subclass within the third estate. I already kind of got ahead of myself with this last chapter. The bourgeoisie, after the, I guess, burghs, bourge, or the market towns. Now this is specifically within France. The bourgeoisie are in France. In England, the small towns are called burghs, so the middle class are called burghers. That's why we use the French term, because it sounds cooler, or at least more sophisticated. Yeah, so the bourgeoisie, or actually no, that's bourgeois. The bourgeoisie has a little E on the end. They spread the Enlightenment up to nobility and down to commoners because they were technically still third estate, but they were rich and enlightened enough to move in the same circles as the nobility, as we're going to see here in just a little bit. But they were still technically third estate, so they often still interacted with commoners. So they were very much a literally a middle class. And the public sphere, again, similar to the Republic of Letters we saw earlier, collection of connections, region, religion, and class, where these enlightened ideals could spread. We're also going to see more of that, because these philosophs, which is a term of these enlightened thinkers, they often write to rulers, and the rulers write back. Like, there's a lot of correspondence between these bourgeois and nobility and the commoners and even the monarchs. It's a whole thing. There's a lot of correspondence going on, which again, this is pushing towards the beginning of like our founding fathers. Our founding fathers were a big part of this. They were a bunch of freaking nerds too, because they signed all their letters as like Greek and Roman orators. I forget. I want to say it was Jefferson, because he was like the biggest nerd. He always would sign his letters as Cicero, who was like this famous Roman orator, and yeah, they were all big nerds. Anyway, here's the bourgeois, I guess, having a good time. This looks difficult when you're in full dress. I mean, this is like balancing I'm basically a frisbee on a stick. That's a lot of work. Yeah, I mean, the middle class is almost becoming nobility at this point, at least in terms of the money they're throwing around. But they're still technically third estate, like in terms of their political and social status. So let's discuss a little bit of the various societies before it gets too late. The Dutch Republic. We mentioned the governmental and religious founding of the Dutch Republic. Again, it being having fought itself free from the Spanish, it being a republic, it being small but actually very rich. It was a refuge for exiles from all over Europe, so it was a hotbed for the Enlightenment. It was the place to go, which also meant that it had everything when it came to the Enlightenment. As we've already seen, state-of-the-art military, religious, and economic practices, It had all sorts of technology. It had state-of-the-art telescopes, new forms of painting. They even grew exotic flowers. I mean, obviously the Dutch are famous for their tulips, which are a pain in the ass to grow. I want to say they were also the ones who invented greenhouses. So like even during the winter, they could grow flowers. However, there were still those that the Dutch considered too radical for their pretty radical nation. Baruch Spinoza, whose theologico-political treatise equated God and nature to the workings of the universe and the Bible as fictional, his works were censored all over Europe, even in the Dutch Republic. That was too much for this time of history. Here's Spinoza. The highest activity a human being can attain is learning for understanding, because to understand is to be free. Again, as an educator, I can at least get on board with that. Learning for understanding's sake is very important. As a historian, I definitely am on board with this. If you want the present to be different from the past, study the past. Know what's happened. Find the patterns. Don't do it again. Don't let the idiots in power do it again, because they will. All right. Let's talk about England. Obviously, England's got quite a little bit. I'll try to get done with England today. Hopefully we can. And then we'll finish for the week. So, after England overthrew its whole absolutism thing with the Civil War, and then I can't remember his name. Cromwell. I want to say Cornwall. Different guy. Beacon in the early Enlightenment, House of Commons was elected from the populace. So that was actually a pretty big deal. It had a representative body elected from the people, which again is like why when we wrote our Declaration of Independence, we like, oh, the king is doing this and the king is doing that. It's like, yeah, we had a representative democracy. Now, technically, we didn't have any people in the House of Commons, so we were not being represented, because it would have been geographically a pain in the butt to like send people across the Atlantic, and that was a common thing for England to not give their colonies representation. So yeah, that was fair, but we were making a point of being like, oh, we're being overruled by a tyranny. It's like, that's not entirely true. But point being, so relatively speaking, England was a pretty good place to be. They had a pretty decent representation. Yeah, they still had a king, but it was equal with the Parliament. John Locke, he was a Whig that had to flee to the Dutch Republic after the Exclusion Crisis, which is to say he wanted to completely kick out James, and is like, oh, I got to get out of here. But then everything worked out fine, so he could move back home. He wrote lots of socio-political works on human rights. He agreed with Francis Bacon that humans had to be able to experiment and see for themselves if something was true, which is cool. For us, he wrote the 2 treatises of government. He argued that mankind naturally gravitated towards a social contract for the good of one another, even without a divinely placed monarch. He argued all people are under this contract, even the king, and should that king break the social contract, the people were obligated to depose him. We used the hell out of his work, because we argued that the king broke the contract due to taxes or whatever, which again were technically being placed by Parliament, but you know, whatever. Anyway, this made more sense back when I made it the first time. John Locke from Lost. Anyway, here's John Locke. All mankind being equal and independent, no one ought to harm another his life, health, liberty, or possessions. Thomas Jefferson did a lot of plagiarizing, by the way. It wasn't plagiarism back then, it was inspiration. if you had side by side the Declaration of Independence and all the stuff he pulled from, boy, it's something. Now, Jefferson was just really good at consolidating stuff. It's fine. I'm for real. I'm not going to throw too much shade at Jefferson, but it is really funny when you look at some of the stuff he pulled from. Scotland. Economically, Scotland was not doing well under the Navigation Acts, as we mentioned. Anything you sent to Europe had to go through London first, which that's dumb. However, in 1707, with the Act of Union, Scotland was now part of the English trade market, which is now officially Britain. So now when I say Britain, I don't have to correct myself because I'm really pedantic about that. Now with Scotland and England joined, it's now officially Britain because that island is technically Britain, and with Scotland and England together, it's now officially Britain. Wales is also there, but Wales and England have been a thing for hundreds of years, so I'm sorry, Wales. This helped the lowlanders that were situated more closely to England, more so than the highlanders that were further north. They were more loyal to their landowners' Catholicism than some new king and queen in London, the Glorious Revolution, if you guys recall. So, in 1745, under Charles Edward Stuart, also known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, and if you're familiar with Scottish slang, you may find that funny. A Highlander army took Scotland and then tried to march on London to restore the Scottish royal line. They were defeated in Culloden in 1746 and ended this potential civil war. Who knows what Bonnie means in Scottish? It rarely refers to a boy. Well, I mean, it doesn't mean girl. It usually is referring to, like, it's like, oh, you wee bonny lass. It's a positive thing, usually. It means pretty. That's Bonnie Prince Charlie. A bunch of Highlanders, if you've ever seen a Scottish Highlander, yeah, they went to war for this guy.
Looks like a girl.
Yeah. Now, that said, because of just how people in Britain are, and when I say Britain, I mean England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, the British Isles, they remember this 1 year attempt at a war. This was during the Scottish referendum, which has been many years ago now. These badges are free. Someday Scotland will be too. This is the 45, as they call this uprising. And so they have buttons with 45 written on them. Everybody knows what this means in Scotland. This means 1745, a little attempted coup that didn't last very long, but everybody in Scotland knows what it means, and Scotland's going to be free. Yeah. It's something else. A little more Scotland before we finish up. Not quite Bonnie Prince Charlie. Adam Smith. I actually just talked about him in my American history class. Traveled abroad as a tutor, learned about laissez-faire, this idea of a free market. Laissez-faire means let it alone, which is to say, let the market do its own thing. Live without restriction of guilds, certain privileges given to people by birth. He wrote an inquiry about the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, which is commonly just referred to as the wealth of nations. Wrote that everyone should work towards their own happiness, work to make things better for everyone around them, avoid restrictions, which is to say tariffs, because that's never been a good idea. Allow natural competition to drive prices, not arbitrary guilds, put forth the image of the invisible hand, which guided the market. The invisible hand is supply and demand. The idea that, it's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. The butcher, the brewer, and the baker make what they make because they expect to make some money out of it. And their supply and your demand is what causes the market to move. Okay, I think this is the last one for Scotland, I hope. Yes, David Hume. Okay, and then we'll move to the French Enlightenment next time. That's the big one. Okay, David Hume. This is it. He liked the idea of the scientific method. Everything needed to be proven by repeated experiments. But even then, human perception could alter the result, which was oddly, really true. He didn't realize how far ahead of the game he was. Literally observing atoms changes their location is weird. There's such thing as an observational bias. Now it's literally an atomic scale, but yeah, it's a thing. He denounced all schools of philosophy, believing any line of thought without proving it was superstition. Now that's okay, a little dramatic. Like Baruch Spinoza, he believed religion was simply a part of the intellectual development of humankind. With science and reason, it was no longer necessary. Again, this is 1700s that he's going into this. So, which I guess is why the SPC Foundation uses Hume as levels of reality. Anyway, that's it for Scotland. I went a little longer than I meant to, but it's not quite 11:15 yet, so we're fine. France is going to take a long time, so we're definitely going to wait until next time for that. So, that's it for today. I'll see you guys on Monday. So yeah, we'll continue on. I'm looking forward to the rest of this.